Hey everybody, how are you? I am Tracy Wallace, and as Brittany said, I am actually new to INE. I've been here about a month, and my role is as director of content for Microsoft and as the primary creator, as of now, of the Microsoft content. INE has had some Microsoft content, but it hasn't really been a huge focus. We've been well over a decade, mostly in the Cisco space, but other networking things as well. And we really want to expand out, and we really want to have, good Microsoft content. And that's also, by the way, you noticed that poll that was up for those of you that might have been here a few minutes early. I think we're going to put that poll up again at the end. And honestly, that's your opportunity to have some voice in the direction that we're going to go as we roll out courses over the coming months and quite honestly, over the coming years. Okay, that's all out of the way. Hopefully you're still with me. Doesn't look like I lost anyone with the spiel, but the spiel's over. So let's get into some content. Today, we're going to talk about Azure multi-factor authentication. And we're going to look at how to apply multi-factor authentication within a conditional access policy. And I have to tell you, I love conditional access policies. It's kind of weird, I guess, but I do. Also, this is content that aligns with some of the new certification. Right now, we're going through, oh, sorry, I said I wouldn't do any more, but just a slight more little plug. The first courses we're rolling out are going to be aligned to the Azure Architecture certification. First new courses, I should say. And honestly, this is part of it. In fact, the slide you see here is part of the presentation for that. With that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at some multi-factor authentication concepts. And I'm going to have to find this. So over on my other screen, incredibly well prepared. There we go. I'm going to bring this over here. But before we go into this, I want to talk about the big picture with multi-factor authentication. Okay. Most of you are probably familiar with the concept of Azure AD authentication. And if you're not, it's a pretty straightforward concept. Let's say that I've got a web application, I've got Azure AD, and I've got a user down here, right? And so this is my web app. This is Azure AD. And this is our intrepid user. And so what happens is that the user is going to attempt to log into the web app. But the web app does not want to authenticate the user. So the web app is going to redirect the user over to Azure AD, where the user will authenticate. We challenge for credentials, we'll provide the credentials. Now, this could even go to a federation scenario. That's outside the scope of what we're dealing with. But in general, what's going to happen is, assuming that the user successfully authenticates, then they're going to be redirected back to the web app with their identity and all is well, right? However, that is not the most secure approach. And probably at this point, if you've used any kind of cloud-based systems, you're probably aware of multi-factor authentication. And the idea of multi-factor authentication is pretty simple. We have a separate system over here, which is my multi-factor authentication. And in this case, today, we're going to be talking about Azure MFA. And with Azure MFA, what happens is that rather than just directly sending the user back as soon as they authenticate with Azure AD is actually going to hand the user off to Azure MFA. And Azure MFA is going to require additional validation of the user's identity. Okay? And then once that happens, then the whole process continues and the user has access to their web-based application. Their cloud app is often how that's going to be referred to. And this architecture is simple. And the architecture is also very cool and very flexible because the MFA really occurs after the confirmation of your identity, right? After you have presented your credentials. And that means that it works in a wide range of scenarios. For example, if you've got, on-prem functionality, you can have the on-prem Azure MFA, which will redirect you over here. If you've got federation, you're using ADFS, you can use that with Azure MFA. And it's a good architecture to really give you a flexible and strong capability. All right, so that wasn't terribly massive. All right, so far so good. Now, what is pretty cool with this is that we have some options in how we implement multi-factor authentication. One way that I can implement multi-factor authentication is to simply, well, that was supposed to be a circle. That was a very sad circle. We're gonna have to remove that. That was unacceptable. We can just say, okay, you need to have Azure MFA, right? And we're done. But the other thing that we can do is we can set up what's called a conditional access policy. And I'm just going to say CAP. Those are my initials for it. That's nothing official, but conditional access policy. And what that does is basically when a user authenticates, it's going to check the conditions as to whether or not the user needs to authenticate with MFA or possibly even has access to the web app to begin with. And we're really going to cover these two concepts in this webinar. All right. With that being said, I think the easiest way to see these, well, is actually see them. So let's take a look at implementing our Azure MFA and our Azure conditional access policy. And if there's time, and I'm almost certain there will be time, because the cool thing is this actually doesn't take that much to set up, but time permitting, I also want to take a look at one other way that we can implement multi-factor authentication, which is by using identity protection, because it layers into identity protection as well if you have that. All right, let's go ahead and take a look. I have a Azure Active Directory tenant or directory, whichever way you want to call it. And I've got a couple of users in here that are going to be my test users. I've got my good friend, Bob Roberts, who should be showing up here any moment, and also Sue. And I didn't have any clever last name for Sue, so she's just Sue. All right, I'm going to use both of these as we go forward. These are cloud-based users, but this works exactly the same, and I've done exactly the same thing with synchronized users from an on-prem environment. All right, so I've got my users. The first thing that I want to do is I want to set up my multi-factor authentication. All right, and the easiest way to get there is to actually go back to users for a moment. Sorry about that. And there's a nice little link here to the multi-factor authentication portal. All right, a little bit of history, the way this works. There's actually 3 different screens, if you will, for managing multi-factor authentication. The first is where we just saw the Azure Blade, as it were, for the Azure Active Directory tenant, where I can link over to this. This is the multi-factor authentication server configuration. And then I can go and perform more detailed configuration in a detail page, which goes back to the standard Azure portal. A little bit confusing, but the good news is there's nice links to click to get us everywhere we need to go. All right, there are a couple things that I can do while in this interface here. I've got my users, and I can simply select a user, or I could group select, and I can enable multi-factor authentication. And I have now enabled multi-factor authentication for Bob Roberts. Okay, well, that was easy. But that might be a little inconvenient if you've got more than one user, right? If you've got thousands or tens of thousands of users, not necessarily the interface that you would want to do this. Of course, you could automate the process, but I'm going to show you with conditional access policy some other things we can do. More important, in my opinion, when you come to this environment is the service settings. This is going to let you set up basic configuration for your multi-factor authentication. And towards the end, after we've kind of covered all this, I am going to talk about licensing because I do think that's important when we're talking about multi-factor authentication. But do know there's essentially 3 different types of licensing that give you different levels of features with your multi-factor authentication. What we have here is pretty much standard across all of the licensing options. All right, the first thing is app passwords. And what that does is it allows you to have multi-factor authentication with non-browser based applications, and pretty much, and it comes down to other things as well, but Outlook is the standard example. Outlook doesn't have a web-based interface, but you can use MFA with it, and what you do is you get an app password, and you'll actually see an app password in just a minute. Okay. I can also have trusted IPs, and there are 2 ways that I can do this. If you are using a federation system, you can skip MFA if people are coming through that federation system. You can also whitelist ranges of IP addresses. So let's say, for example, and clearly, of course, this is not where it would be coming from. Let's say that that is the public IP range for my corporation. I know if a request is coming in from inside the firewall, we don't need MFA, right? Or inside the corporation, we don't need MFA, so I can do that. Obviously, 10.10 is private, so that wouldn't be of much use. Now, what's more important is the verification options. Here are the options that we have. All right, call to phone, which is currently grayed out. The reason why the call to phone is grayed out is because I set this up with the trial version of Azure Premium P2. The first month is trial, and you can't have a call to a phone with the trial. So if that's something you want, and you start out with, let's say, the P2 trial, Premium P2 trial, and you see it's grayed out, don't worry about it. Just go ahead and go through the purchase process, and you'll be able to do that. All right, text message to phone. Pretty obvious. Notification through mobile app. That is the Microsoft Authenticator app, which is cross-platform, iOS, Android, and of course, the wildly popular Windows Phone. I had a Windows Phone. I'm a little bitter that I can't have one anymore. All right, then this is new, and this is really interesting. Verification code from mobile app or hardware token. Azure MFA now supports OAuth token-based authentication. Which means that it will integrate with a wide range of hardware and potentially software-based MFA systems. So that's pretty cool. That's a capability. Just want to know that it's there. And I can also allow users to remember their MFA on devices they trust for a period of 1 to 60 days. By default, it is 14. All right, so far, this is really what there is, pretty straightforward. All right, I'm going to go ahead and click this link down here that says Manage Advanced Settings. And this is the that I'm sorry, was the most exciting part of the entire webinar there. Hopefully not. Hopefully not. All right. I come in, I'm actually not going to start where this is because I'm going to go up here and I'm going to go through some of these settings, and I'm going to do it quickly, just kind of take you on a tour. The account lockout is pretty straightforward. You can set a number of denials to trigger lockout, how long to wait before that's reset, and then how long you're actually locked out. So for example, if I take and fail the MFA twice, I have to wait an hour. Otherwise, the next time I fail it, I'll be locked out for 3 hours, right? If I wait an hour, I get 3 more tries. That's all this is. I have the ability to manually block and unblock users. And I can just add a user to block. And let's see, I've got to hide that toolbar there. There we go. And I've got, you can see the user that I want to block and the reason, but I don't want to block anyone. Also, if somebody is blocked, you can unblock them. Now, fraud alert, somebody gets that notice on their phone at 3 a.m. because this is when all bad things happen, is at 3 in the morning. They get this notice on their phone at 3 a.m. that they're trying to log in from another country. Probably not legitimate, right? And so what this does is it allows a user to submit a fraud alert. right? And it will automatically block. So that's another way to add a block. Makes sense, right? I get that 3 a.m. call. I really don't want to deal with this until I get in the morning. Fine, just block the account. Easy enough. Notifications, this is going to be who gets the notifications that, for example, a fraud alert has been sent. OAuth tokens, this is that new feature, and it's no longer in preview, which is cool, that allows you to add tokens from a hardware-based token provider. And there's a number of them. I will tell you that is outside of my purview, but I do know that there are a number of them that now work with Azure MFA, Azure AD MFA. Phone call settings, if you're going to use phone calls, which of course I can't right now, you can set the caller ID, and you can also actually add custom greetings and a few other settings, not huge. Skip over providers because those are now deprecated. Now the MFA server is an on-premises server, and you can use this basically to bring MFA into your Active Directory domain environment, your on-prem environment. And the licensing is the same for the server as it is if you're in the cloud. In fact, the server leverages the cloud base. It just gives you that server-based interface and gives you a few extra settings. For example, I've got two-way text message timeout I can set there. I can use a one-time bypass. Okay? And so, Bob has his phone, he gets a text message on his phone, he forgot his phone, and he really needs to log in. All right, so he could come by, and after lots of groveling, I might let him in. All right, caching rules, this has to do with if I'm going into an application and it's using MFA, there may be some time delay for the first MFA request, and it may send additional requests. This just caches those requests rather than making the user go through MFA multiple times. And once the first one comes back successful, the other ones would be marked successful as well. I think server status, pretty obvious. Right now I don't have a server installed, so mine would not be of much use. And I have an activity report. The activity report is not based on the MFA server. And there are no results in the last 24 hours because I really haven't been using this. All right, so that is setting up MFA. Now, what about the user experience? If you recall, hopefully it doesn't seem like too long ago, I added Bob. And let's open up an incognito window here. And let's go to the Microsoft AD, Azure AD portal. I'm going to go to myapps.microsoft.com. And I'm going to log in as Bob. And again, I do this with on-prem users as well, works exactly the same. If I actually put in my password correctly. And now Bob is being challenged for more information. And that is because I have multi-factor authentication set up. Now, one thing while this is coming up that's pretty cool is if you've got the premium edition of Azure AD and you want to let your users have self-service password reset, you can do that. And it's kind of a combined registration for both multi-factor authentication and self-service password reset, although there's some differences in the techniques that are available from each. But in this case, I just have MFA. Okay, so pretty straightforward. I'm going to go ahead and I am now giving out my cell phone number. Please don't spam call me. And there we go. Maybe I'll see if Brittany can, wipe that out on the when this is recorded. Okay, now it's sending me a verification code, which is coming up on my wicked cool watch. It is not an Apple Watch, by the way. Not that you would care, but I always have to say that because my kids and I, we get into that. They're Apple folks, not so much me. Anyways, that's beside the point. Let's go ahead and verify. All right, now this is important here, which of course suggests other things weren't, but they were. All right? Notice this code. This is an app password, right? So if I'm using this with Outlook, Outlook or other Microsoft Office products, or conceptually Apple Mail too, but I don't tend to use Apple products too much. In any case, I could take this code here. And remember, right now this is Bob. So this is what Bob would say, but Bob's good with that. And Bob is now logged in with multi-factor authentication. And Bob will stay signed in with multi-factor authentication. All right. Honestly, that's the multi-factor authentication part of this. Let's just go ahead and jump right into what I think is far more interesting, which is conditional access. I just got a ding. Okay. I'm being told by the extremely capable Brittany that ding meant nothing. So sorry, y'all. This is first time doing one of these for my new company here. So still working a few of the bugs out. All right. But what I want to do is I want to go ahead and kind of unwind MFA and come back to my Azure AD tenant. I'm going to come in here to the tenant, and I'm going to come down to conditional access policy, which is right here, conditional access. And I'm going to click on that. And the first thing you will see is that there are some built-in policies, and we'll get to those after I go through and show you how you can create your own policy. There's also a what if, where you could see what policies might apply to a particular user. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and go to new policy. Now with a policy, when you create a conditional access policy, all right, I should let you know that there are really two components to a conditional access policy. Okay. There are the assignments and the access controls. The assignments define who the policy applies to, and the access control, I should say who and what. And the access control basically determines whether or not you can get in, and if you can get in, what are the additional requirements that you have to have in order to actually get in. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at this. I am going to create a policy, and I have no creativity whatsoever, so we're going to just call this demo policy. Please give your policies better names. And I'm really just going to go down through here, and users and groups, hopefully that's relatively obvious. I can choose the users and groups. Now, pretty interesting interface. Again, the fact that I consider this interesting may say something about me, not sure. But here we go. I can have none, so obviously this simply doesn't apply. Or I can say I want this to apply to everybody. When you do that, you have to be careful not to lock yourself out. And in fact, it is possible to set up a policy that would lock everybody out, and at that point, it's a submission to Microsoft for a help request ticket. All right, but I'm going to go ahead and go with select users and groups. And there's a few things I can do: all guests and external users. Oh, that's something pretty cool. Not only does conditional access apply to external users and groups, as you can see here, so does MFA. So I can actually set up a policy to include guest users and enforce MFA. So before they get to my app that they're trying to get to, whether it's even Azure or Office 365 or whatever it is I'm giving access to a guest user, they can actually be challenged with MFA. Right, but I'm just going to go down here to users and groups, and I am going to select users and groups. And please don't do what I'm about to do, because this just seems unfair. In this case, I am going to apply this to one person. Now I can obviously apply this to a group, but I don't have anyone in this group because, quite honestly, I forgot to put them in there. That's okay. It will work with Sue, and it will demonstrate fine with Sue. All right, let's go ahead. I now have the first stage, which is users and groups. Now I need to determine what it is this applies to. So I have the who, now I need the what. And there's two options. There's cloud apps and there's user actions, but user actions are not really very significant right now. That would just be registering your security information. So I'm going to go with cloud apps. And notice there's include and exclude and kind of the same options we had with people. Like say all cloud apps or select apps. And I'm going to go with select apps. Now this list would show all of the apps that are registered, all of the enterprise apps, the cloud apps that are registered for your Active Directory, your Azure Active Directory. So this could be, Office 365, which is becoming Microsoft 365. It could be Concur, it could be Salesforce, whatever it is, right? You're not limited to just this. I'm limited to this right now because I really don't have too many things loaded on this Azure AD account. But again, this will serve nicely for the purpose of demonstration. I'm actually going to choose Microsoft Azure Management. That's going to apply to the portal as well as the command line tools, whether it's a CLI or PowerShell. And we'll go ahead and select that. And done. Now, those two selections are the requirements. You have to have at least those for a policy. But we're going to go ahead and run through and talk about the other options. Let's go ahead and take a look at conditions. Okay, here are my conditions. Now, some of these conditions you should know are dependent upon other systems. For example, sign-in risk. I can apply this based on sign-in risk, and if I do, I can select these sign-in risks that I want this to apply to. Those sign-in risks are coming from the identity protection service. All right, so if I'm running identity protection, it is going and it is checking out sign-in risk, and I can assign that here with conditional policy. Don't want to do that though. Device platform. So maybe I want this to apply only for certain devices. And I can configure that. And for initially it's any device, or I can go and you can see the different options. Android, iOS, the ever popular Windows Phone, Windows, and Mac OS. And of course I can exclude and do the same thing with exclusions. Now, locations are very cool, and it's entirely possible. I forgot to show you locations first, but we'll get back there. You can define your own locations, and locations can be based on one of two things. Either they can be based on geopolitical boundaries, right? So maybe you want different rules depending on where in the world a request is coming from. They can also be based on IP address ranges, right? So maybe I've got trusted IP address ranges that I just want to, exclude from most of the more restrictive policies. We'll get to that. Now these two options, client apps, notice it's in preview. It's been in preview for a while. Of course, it's your decision whether you choose to implement a preview feature. We'll go ahead and configure that. And you see the options that we have here. So this applies to browser or mobile apps and desktop clients, and which of these will it apply to? By the way, Exchange, particularly Exchange Online as part of Office 365, has a lot of features, not surprisingly, that tie in with Azure AD and even multi-factor authentication. But we are going to, again, leave that off. And next, we're going to take a look at device state. Not that much here. Now, this is another one that, first of all, it's kind of funny. Right now, it's just all devices because clearly it's really in preview. Eventually, this is going to have two types of device state, which are actually captured in another place in the conditional access policy. And that's going to be a combination of two things. One is going to be a device state as defined by an MDM, such as Microsoft Intune. And so you could have a compliant device or non-compliant device. And also whether or not it's a hybrid join device. So this would be a device that is an on-prem device. It's part of your Azure or your Active Directory domain, and someone is traveling with it, and they're subject to MFA, or subject to Azure AD, I should say. We're going to leave that alone. All right, and so those are your conditions. We're done with that. Again, the only things really required are the user groups and cloud apps. Now, the access controls. And this is actually pretty simple. First of all, I can block access. So I might want to just block access for whatever reason based on certain conditions. You can absolutely do that. But the default is to grant access. Then I have the ability to further filter that down. One, I can require multi-factor authentication. That's what I'm actually going to do. I can require the device to be marked as compliant. That again is going to integrate with an MDM, in fact, with Intune. Require hybrid Azure AD joined device. So what's interesting is both of these options are both a condition as well as a grant action. Okay? And I'll show you kind of how that plays out in just a moment. I've got required approved client app, and Microsoft has a list of approved client apps that you can filter this by. And require app protection policy preview. This is kind of interesting. This uses a Microsoft Intune policy. And you can, if you've got Intune, go in, set up policies and tie that in to your MFA. All right. Now, for multiple controls, so if I check more than one of those, I can either require all or require only one. All right. So I can say I need multi-factor authentication unless it's a hybrid join. Right. And so that's easy enough. But we're going to go ahead and require all selected controls and hit select. Now the last option here, session, and then we are getting done with this. I know I'm just sort of traveling through here. Okay, there are a few options down here in session as to how these access controls are applied. Okay, and what they do is they allow limited experiences within the cloud app. The one that is grayed out here, use app enforced restrictions, that is only available if you have all apps. So if I went to the cloud apps and I selected all apps, I could check this. Right now, that only applies to Exchange Online and SharePoint Online. And what it does is it will send device information after you go through your Azure AD login. It will send device information to those applications. And within the application, then that can determine what your rights are within the application. So if you're on a non-approved device or a non-compliant device, you may have limited functionality relative to what your account normally would, just as an example. Conditional access app control, that's kind of interesting. This is a reverse proxy. What happens when you set this up is that with your links for the application, so if you go to myapp.microsoft.com and you click on an application that's protected by this policy, instead of going directly to the application, you're actually going to go to a URL provided by Azure AD, and you're going to go through that URL, and it's going to control many aspects of your interaction. So it is a kind of an inserted reverse proxy. You can also set up sign-in frequency. That's going to determine how frequently someone has to, really not how frequently, but what's the period of inactivity before someone's automatically logged out. And persistent browser session. Persistent browser session is allows you to set, when somebody leaves or closes their browser, they open it back up, they're still logged in, right? And that is actually tied to that prompt you get, right? Do you want to stay logged in? And you actually even have some ways of controlling that, but this is how you would set that up through conditional access. So these are all conditional access. Now, bringing it all back, because I know that was kind of a long journey. We've got users and groups have to say who it applies to, what it applies to, and potentially any conditions. And then what are the access controls? I'm going to grant, but I'm going to require multi-factor authentication. I'm going to go ahead and enable this and create it. Now remember, this policy is really basically picking on Sue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and log in as Sue a couple different ways. I'm going to open up incognito window and go again to My Apps. And this time we're going to log in as Sue. And we are again going to try to remember to type in the password correctly. And I didn't, but I remembered it before I hit enter, so you don't know that. All right, and signing in. Sure, doesn't, in this case, there's that stay signed in. Doesn't matter because this is incognito. All right. Notice that Sue came in to my apps and she was not challenged for any additional authentication. I'm going to go ahead and close this so we get a fresh login for Sue. I'm going to go through the same thing, but this time we're going to go to full screen portal.azure.com. And let's go to Sue again. And now, because Sue's going to an app, in this case, the portal, that's protected by conditional access policy and that requires MFA, now she's required to implement MFA. And by the way, of course, she's not going to be prompted, and neither will Bob be prompted for this additional information every single time they log in, because that's going to be stored. And again, make Brittany do her work in post-production and send myself a text. Please do not screenshot that and send it to all your friends and neighbors. All right. And I dread the day when Microsoft comes back and says, you have used this phone number too many times. At that point, I will literally have to get a new phone. So I am verifying that information. So here is the user experience for Sue. Again, remember in the case of Bob, Bob was required to provide multi-factor authentication regardless of how Bob logged in. But Sue is only required to provide additional authentication, multi-factor authentication, when she is going into a new app, which for some reason is going to require twice. This time it should just send me the request. Oh, all right. This is actually set up for, and I'm not going to go through this because it's outside the scope of this, but these options are actually for self-service password reset. I know that because I see security questions. And this is a little bit of me being slightly careless and not separating the two out. Okay? But it's actually kind of cool. And you'll notice that the authentication phone, it says that it's already been entered. I would need to verify it for self-service, password reset, and then authentication email and security questions. But again, that's outside of what we're going to cover today. It is in the course I'm building though. So there we go. All right, so that really is most of what we have. I do want to show you two more things in conditional access, and then I'm going to pop over really briefly to identity protection and show you how that can tie in as well. Right? Notice in my conditional access policies, I now have the demo policy, but there are these additional baseline policies. So these are exactly what it sounds like. These are just policies that Microsoft thinks could be useful across pretty much all tenants. So let's go ahead and take a look at one of these policies. With the built-in policies, you'll notice you have very little options. You basically do not use the policy, or you use the policy immediately. And what this is going to do is require, this particular policy is going to require MFA for all of these different roles. All right, and I'm not going to put you to sleep by going through all of them, but that's the idea of the baseline roles. One other thing I want to show you is named locations. I mentioned this, that I forgot to show you that first. And this is actually pretty cool. I can create a new location. Easy enough. And let's say INE RTP. And I can base that on IP ranges or countries and regions. And if I select countries and regions, I literally get a list of countries and regions that I can choose. Okay, but we're going to go with the much safer IP ranges. It's going to let me put in CIDR notation, which again, of course, this is not actually what our public IP address range is, but you get the idea. All right, and so what that would allow me to do is use that location as part of my definition of my policies. And I can mark that as trusted and go ahead and hit create, and it's fine, it's not hurting anything. Okay, and then when I go to my actual policies, just pop back in there really quickly. And that's where I could go to the locations condition. And it should have, there we go, let's say yes, selected. I should be able to pull up my location. All right, so I actually have an HQ, which I forgot I had actually created, INE, RTP, and then there's other MFA trusted IPs. So you can tie this into your MFA if you've got that set up. All right, that is it for policies. Let's go ahead and close that. All right, one other thing that I want to show you, then I want to talk briefly about licensing this, and that is identity protection. Identity protection is a service that you can activate within Azure. It's tied to Azure AD, but it has its own blade in the portal. Not that that really matters. It does require the Azure AD Premium P2 tier of your Azure AD. And what this does is, in a nutshell, because I'm not going to go deep into this, it runs in the background, and it's basically machine learning, where it's looking for patterns. And there's two kinds of risks that it's looking for, two kinds of risky patterns. One is identity risk, and the other is sign-in risk, right? So identity risk could be something, for example, like they actually monitor known sites where people sell identities. And if your identity shows up on one of those, that's going to be determined to be a high-risk identity. And then you've got login identity or login risk, where maybe if somebody always logs in from Chicago and now all of a sudden they're trying to log in from Perth, Australia. Nothing against Perth, Australia, but that might be a risky login. And that's really how this works. And it's really pretty simple. You've got user risk policy and sign-in risk policy. I'm only going to handle sign-in risk policy because it's the one that ties into MFA, which is, of course, the topic of this webinar. All right, here's what I'm going to do. Assignments. I can go all users, or I can select users and groups. Okay. Conditions. This looks fairly familiar, but again, it's a different set of conditions. I've just got my risk conditions. Okay, and I mentioned the risk conditions over on the conditional access policy. This is within identity protection itself. So I've got low and above, medium and above, or high. And then I can set up access controls. And again, you see kind of that similar interface, right? I can block access or allow access, but if I allow access, I can also require multi-factor authentication. And that's kind of the payoff of heading over here. All right, that's it as far as a tour of multi-factor authentication and conditional access policy. I do, as I mentioned, want to bring up the concept of, licensing, right? Because it'd be great if all of this were just free. As it turns out, it's not. And for multi-factor authentication, there's actually 3 different ways that this can be licensed. One, you actually can get it with a free subscription, but only applied to your global admins. So if I'm using the free Azure AD tier, and I want my global admins to have to go through multi-factor authentication, I can set that up. But that's going to be kind of a stripped down version of multi-factor authentication. And the easiest way to see this, and I'll actually bring this up because I've got it somewhere and I don't see it over there, but the pricing page is great. All of Microsoft's pricing pages are great for just getting that quick list of what features are. Anyways, so if you're free, if you're on the free tier, that's going to be your oh my gosh, global administrators, almost forgot the word there. The second level is Office 365. If you've got Office 365 licenses, then your users can use multi-factor authentication. Simple as that. Okay, it is not the absolute full-featured multi-factor authentication. To get that, you need Azure AD Premium P1, and that is a license, or Azure AD Premium P2. Also, if you've got the mobility and security service, then E3, I think it's E3 version of that, will give you Premium P1, and E5 version of that will give you Premium P2. Okay, so it's still tied to Premium. But those are your licensing options for Azure AD and how they tie into multi-factor authentication. And that really actually concludes the material that I wanted to present to you. And so I'm not sure, I heard a couple of dings. I'm not sure if those were questions or not. And I'm gonna ask you to bear with me as I attempt to use this environment. And let's see here. This is showing up. Okay. I have good afternoon, everyone. I'm looking at the training catalog and wanted to see if you had courses for the MS100 and MS101 certificates. I don't see them. Are they on the roadmap? Absolutely, yes, they are on the roadmap. And again, this is kind of going back. It's a great question, and kind of going back to what I said at the very beginning. And remember, this is not my fault that I'm now going to, give you a little bit of I&E here. We really are, I personally am really excited about getting to really start up, not start up, because we do have some Microsoft courses, but really press forward with our Microsoft catalog. And certainly to start out with, we are aligning our courses with the certifications. And our initial alignment is going to be with the new role-based certifications. Now, there's many of them that I am going to take. I'm going to take all the Azure ones, and we'll do some SQL Server, some development. But I also have some colleagues that I've worked with for a long time that we are bringing in so that we can speed up the development of some of these courses, one of which that is very high on the roadmap is the MS100 and 101. So I kind of jumped the gun a little bit from a marketing perspective in terms of having this webinar right now, just because the catalog is really just in its starting phases. But I was kind of excited to get out there, and this is a topic that I think is kind of fun. So hopefully you bear with me, and hopefully that answers that question. Now I'm gonna go through the fourth wall here. Brittany, was that the only unanswered question? Okay. Well, if that's the case, then I'm going to go ahead and if there's no other questions, let you out of here a bit early. Tell you what, I will bring this up. If you want to get in touch with me, bring up my instructor contact slide here. There we go. There you go. There are all of the ways that you can get in touch with me. And I am more than happy, really looking forward to getting this content out there. And the goal is that we're aligning with the certifications, but my goal personally is to give you expert training beyond the certifications, so that ideally, if you get through it and you understand everything, that you'll be well suited. Can't guarantee you'd pass, but you'd be well suited for the exams, but also have that ability to go pass. And love to have an ongoing conversation. And I think at the end we may put that poll back up. Yep, we are going to go ahead and put that poll back up. This is your opportunity, as kind of like that question. If you want to help us in our direction as we go forward, love to hear from you. Okay, at this point I'm just kind of rambling, so I'm going to stop and I'm going to turn things back over to Brittany. All right, I got the thumbs up on that one. So thank you all again very much, and look forward to doing some more of these and hopefully get you out to some more of these.